Okay. Hi, everyone. This is our lecture on chapter 3. Let me expand my screen here. Okay, so chapter 3 focuses on environmental health influences on disease and injury. Okay, so I'm going through the lecture through the PowerPoint, but I'll also probably kind of click off the PowerPoint and refer you back to a few resources that are on Moodle. Okay, so anyway, let's get started. Okay, I in the first chapter and I think in the second chapter as well, I kind of had or all of the learning outcomes were listed in the beginning. I think I sort of pulled out those beginning slides and just basically introduce those learning outcomes kind of when we're going to talk about the content. Also, there may be a couple. I think the section that's on environmental epidemiology in your textbook, I'm leaving out, and so you'll see that that's sort of left out of here. But otherwise, we pretty much cover the whole entire chapter. Okay, so the first part of the lecture will describe the relationship between social environment, physical environment, built environment, right? So we have to talk about what do we mean by environment, because we're talking about environmental agents that can cause disease, okay? So if you just take a look here in terms of a definition of environmental health or what environmental health is, as basically set by the National Environmental Health Association, you can take a minute and if you need to pause it and just read what this says. And I think, it's pretty obvious kind of what environmental health is, but I think as you go through the chapter, probably appreciate it a little bit more and kind of think about all of the different environmental sources kind of that can potentially lead to disease. Okay? All right. So we will be talking about or sort of categorizing these environmental agents in sort of physical hazards, right? Chemical hazards, biological hazards. So we're going to talk more about that as we move through. All right, so if you take a look at this is the ecological model for environmental health. And so we can, you break it down into these different boxes here in terms of physical environment, social environment, and genetic environment. All of these types of environments will impact health, right? So maybe if we think about environment, we didn't necessarily think about the social environment, right? So important to think about that. So, this includes social and psychosocial factors. If we talk about physical environment, we're talking, about chemical exposures, right? Physical meaning like, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of what these, actually, I don't even have to introduce that right now. The next couple slides, we'll talk about exactly what do we mean by a chemical type of agent, right? What about physical? What about biological? What do we mean by built environment, natural environment? Built environment, I think you guys can kind of figure out. This is us developing, right? Building structures that itself creates some environmental or can create its own environmental hazards, right? Also, what's present in the natural environment, if you just think of like allergens that are produced naturally by trees and plants, right? That's an example of that. If we talk about genetic environment, this is your internal genetic environment, right? So we mentioned polymorphisms or SNPs or small nucleotide polymorphisms in the genetics chapter. Okay, so that's kind of an example of what we mean there. So the point is that all three of these different types of environments play on each other, right? And this is kind of showing you here too, if you kind of see these arrows and follow them this way, that changes in the social environment and the physical environment can then lead to or sort of cause changes in the genetic environment. And again, the interplay between all three of these then will impact disease. So we're going to talk more about these as we move through. So if you look at the top here, we're considering things sort of on the individual level first. So if we think about social environment, as shown in that figure, we mentioned social and psychosocial factors. So these are things like gender, education, employment status, right? What social networks you're a part of and how those people can influence your behaviors and then therefore influence health, right? Other interpersonal interactions, maybe with family members or what have you, right? So I'm sure we're all aware that these sort of social and psychosocial categories that are listed here can then lead to maybe stress, right? Which is actually the topic of the next chapter, okay? If we talk about physical environment, right, where you live, where you work, where you play, there are lots of factors kind of within that physical environment. I kind of pointed this out on the last slide too. Here it says here gene environment interaction, right? So again, there are environmental factors that can then impact genetic factors, okay? So this is mentioning here, remember we talked about epigenetics, and remember in the genetics chapter I said that there are environmental chemicals, or there are chemicals or molecules that can lead to epigenetic changes, and this is exactly what this is referring to. Okay, so it says non-genomic, right? Because we're talking about epigenetic changes. So things like it can add methyl groups to DNA, right? Or it can add methyl groups. It can add methyl groups to DNA. It can add methyl groups to histones that are associated with the DNA, and that can then alter transcription. Remember, transcription is the production of RNA, which then leads, and then if we go through translation from there, it's going to lead to the production of protein. Okay, so that's why then you can see some altered phenotypic expression because of this, okay? And also this can be passed on, okay? All right. If we talk about a little bit more about social environment now on the community level, okay? So again, notice at the top it says community level here. Now we talk about, you know, neighborhood community factors, like what resources are available in that community, right? So we can call that social capital. If you see this term here, social cohesion, this is the idea that does everyone have a shared commitment toward respect for the values and the rights of others, or does that not really exist? That's going to be something that's important within that social environment. Wealth or impoverishment, again, this is on a community level. So then it also mentions here psychosocial stress that obviously can be introduced if there is impoverishment, right? If there is not a lot of social capital, okay? Mentions again here, availability and accessibility of goods and services, okay? So in that community, is there sufficient food, or is there sufficient access to food, to healthcare, right? To education. Okay, if we think about community level and we think about the physical environment on the community level, air and water quality, right? You know, or me living in my house, I'm not the one who treats my water, right? And I don't have I guess it's not my responsibility, or I'm not going to have, I don't have the ability, I guess that's the word I was looking for, to treat my water. I guess I can add an extra water filter or something like that. But bottom line is, if there is not proper air, you know, if the air quality is not good, there's not much you can do about it as an individual. Okay. If water quality is not good, same thing. There's not much you can do about that. Okay. So again, this is all on the community level. It says nutritional quality and safety here. Again, thinking about water, soil, air, right? All these other sort of factors that can impact that physical environment. Again, things that are sort of out of the individual's control, or that are not only going to affect the individual, they're going to affect that entire community. Again, if you think about that built environment specifically, okay, I think this is kind of obvious, a lot of this stuff. We're talking about human-made, issues, right? So if you think about just housing complexes or apartment buildings in terms of, again, how that heating and cooling system is set up, maybe it's not, properly set up. And so maybe the way that air is recycled is not appropriate. Maybe the temperature is not really regulated to the temperature that it should be. Okay. If you think about transportation of goods and people, and how that's set up, if there isn't a good system that's set up, that then can lead to, induce environmental types of agents that can then have health effects. So if you think about transportation systems specifically here, right? Public transportation, streets, highways. Again, if there are appropriate streets and highways, people then don't have access to healthcare, maybe don't have access to food that they need, right? If there isn't public transportation and a lot of people don't have cars, again, they won't have that access. Also, in terms of how that public transportation is managed, right? Is it clean? Okay. Is it reliable? All of these things on the community level can affect health. Okay. Again, if you think about physical safety hazards, right? Traffic patterns, violence, these all, again, are part of that sort of built environment within the community. Here, accessibility to recreational venues, right? Parks, sidewalks, and paths. Again, on the community level, if there isn't access to this, again, this will directly impact health. Okay. If you think about population level, okay, it says here, some of the effects of the environmental factors can be dramatic, right? So again, if you're summing all of these things together and you really look at this on the population level, you can see that it can have pretty great effects. And so here, a little factor here from the World Health Organization. So it says environmental factors contribute significantly to 83% of the 102 major diseases, injuries, and fatalities that are actually tracked by the World Health Organization. Okay. So obviously, right, we always talk about, what causes a certain disease? Well, it's a combination of environmental factors and genetic factors. Okay. So now we're saying, well, what are those environmental factors, right? And so we know that environmental factors contribute greatly to most diseases. Okay. So now we're just specifically talking about what are some of those factors. And there are a lot of them. It says here, contribute to majority of globally tracked alterations. That's kind of going along with this. So again, if we're talking about most diseases that we track on a global level, environmental factors are going to impact those diseases. If you take a look at, I don't have a picture of this. So some things, like I said, I'll refer back to some PDFs that are on Moodle, and I'll show you that in a second when I get to one of those. This is just referring here. Oh wait, I lie. Yeah, I have it here on the next slide. So sorry. This is referring to this Healthy People 2020. And I mentioned it probably in chapter 1, also in chapter 2. And if you look at that, it's on page 49 of your textbook. It's also on the next slide. I'll show you that in a second. But the idea is showing you that one of the goals in that Healthy People sort of initiative, right, was to, promote environmental health, right, or to try to conserve or change or what have you, environmental health. So things like focusing on outdoor air quality, right, groundwater quality. These are all things on the community level. Toxic substances like lead, right? So if you look at the next slide, that's what this is it's showing you an example of one of these initiatives or goals from Healthy People 2020, okay? Because again, a lot of these things are not, you as the individual are maybe not able to control them, right? So as a community or as a population, everyone has to sort of make this a priority, okay? All right, if you take a look at this is figure 3.2, and it's showing you these concepts that are related to environmental health. So as I just said, most diseases, I would venture to say all diseases are affected by environmental factors in some way, okay? So this is kind of drawing some relationships specifically between environmental health and certain concepts that would be affected by environmental health. So I guess I wrote down here a little examples here. So air quality on lung function and oxygenation. So if you think about that, if you look here, you look at oxygenation here, what's a specific example there? Asthma, right? So asthma can be initiated by pollution, right? By inhaling smoke, right? All sorts of different things. This sort of allergic, I don't know, sometimes you hear it called like allergic asthma, or that it's basically, like I said, initiated or induced by allergens in the environment. Also, some other examples here, chemical and plant toxins can actually alter skin integrity. So I believe this is showing you tissue integrity. Okay. We mentioned before, so I have written down here other examples, right? So if we're doing this live, I'd ask you guys, hey, give me some other examples if you look at these concepts of kind of diseases you might think of that are related here. So I mentioned before the fact that there are certain chemicals that could be found in the environment that can induce epigenetic changes, right here, that then can potentially lead to disease. If you kind of think about my asthma example, you can kind of see how this concept would be related as well. And so that allergen is going to induce inflammation in the airways, and that's what's going to trigger asthma. And so that you can have the same kind of inflammation produced that can lead to other health effects as well. Okay, so anyway, you can take, wait, 1 second. Let me just see something. I thought I had a few other kind of things listed down here. Yeah, so if you guys look in the notes when you're looking at the PowerPoint, there sometimes are notes written down there that add some extra things here. So things like, right, carbon monoxide, cigarette smoke can lead to lung disease. So if, again, we're thinking about oxygenation, if we talk about inhalation of different pathogens, obviously we can think that's obviously pertinent right now, right? Pathogens like, COVID-19, right? Other viruses, other bacteria can lead to infections, pulmonary infections. So, I mean, you can kind of see this too, that they're definitely, or the pulmonary system is definitely very susceptible to environmental issues or environmental factors or things that are present kind of in the air. Obviously, you're going to, a lot of them will affect the pulmonary system, right? Because of being able to inhale them. And then obviously if you inhale something, it's going into your respiratory structures, right? Into your pulmonary system. There's also evidence that there are certain toxins that can lead to cardiovascular problems. That's where this concept comes into play, the perfusion concept. Okay. So anyway, those are some examples there, and you can kind of see how these things all fit together. All right, so let's go to the next learning outcome, which is to classify some of these environmental hazards, right? According to their nature, right? Transport media, routes of exposure, and outcomes. So all of these sort of classifications are important to consider, okay? All right, so as I said, there are these classifications. So nature of the hazard, and we're going to talk about what that means, right? So is it biological, chemical, physical, or psychosocial? And we sort of already mentioned that, okay? So we can classify it in that way, but it's also important to consider these other classifications as well, right? Transport media, exposure routes, setting, and outcomes. And so you can take a look at this table that basically kind of breaks this down. So if we look at nature of the hazard, can be either biological, chemical, physical, or psychosocial. We talk about transport media, air, right? Water, soil, food, and we're going to talk about all these things a little bit more as I move through the lecture. Routes of exposure. Are they inhaled? Again, I kind of just mentioned this. Things that are inhaled a lot of times will sort of primarily or initially affect the pulmonary system. They then could infect other systems as well, but particularly things that are inhaled are going to have effects on the lungs, right? Ingestion. You eat it and you can be exposed that way. Dermal absorption. So this is, again, being absorbed through the skin. I kind of mentioned that on the last slide as well. Transplacental. So this is obviously, this is the fetus being exposed to something that the mother has ingested. Okay. And then you have to think about settings, right? Where are these, where would you be exposed to these hazards? Meaning, are these hazards that you would be exposed to in the home, like carbon monoxide, in the workplace, right? School, or community? And then if you think about outcomes, right? What type of outcomes do these particular hazards lead to, right? Are they mutagens? Are they teratogens? Are they carcinogens? Okay. You can also think about what organ would be primarily affected, right? So like it's a cardiotoxicant, it's immunotoxicant. Okay, so these are all ways that we can classify hazards, and all actually important to consider all of these different ways of classifying them. Okay, I guess that's important. Yeah, okay, so let's look at that first, and then I will pull up another, sorry, I just wanted to see where we're at. I thought that slide, it was necessary for me to pull up. So we're talking about kind of these different classifications, right? And sort of routes of exposure. And so this gives you a nice, kind of a nice summary or overview of different exposure points, right? If you kind of look here, and how then, multiple sort of people on different levels, or even animals, what have you, right? Multiple parts of this ecosystem, of this population or community, can be affected just by one spill here, okay? And this is basically figure 3.3 that's in your book. I think I pulled it from somewhere else just because it was easier that way, but it's essentially the exact same almost the exact same picture. So again, if we look at this, important to kind of understand what's going on here. Here's your spill of some sort of toxin, right? Maybe a chemical, maybe it's just oil spill, whatever. Some of this, if it's volatile, can be released into the air, right? And so then now you got this, if you look at the medium here, it's air. So somebody who's standing maybe over here or right here, maybe this person too, can inhale some of these particles, these chemical particles this way, right? So here's one route of exposure, inhalation. Also, though, what's happening here, if we have a spill like this, it's going to leach, right? It's going to leach into the soil, okay? If it leaches into the soil, plants can take it up. Animals then eat those plants, the grass, right? And then if people eat those animals, you can kind of see how there's these different routes of exposure that can happen here. Also, if it leaches into the soil, likely it can get into the water supply, right? And then you can ingest this by drinking, okay? So showing you another exposure point here as well. Okay, so you can kind of see how just sort of complex and how all of these different types of or routes of exposure can happen just from one spill here. Okay. All right, now there's something called a sentinel health event. So when we're talking about environmental exposures, we can label certain diseases as sentinel health events if they're going to affect on the population level. Okay, so it says here, some diseases can potentially cause health problems to others in the home, work, and community environments, not just on the individual level or population level. So I guess the idea is that you have somebody has a certain infection, it then will pose a threat to the whole population. Again, we can think of this now with COVID, right? In terms of virus, you know, this virus has potential sort of, this is even not even population level, this is global level, okay? And these are recognized through surveillance, population-based surveillance. So if we talk about epidemiology and being able to kind of track these things on a large scale, right? This is when these types of things will be picked up, okay? I mean, I guess if you think about it, so I guess when I kind of initially looked at this, it's, and maybe you're thinking the same thing, well, wouldn't anything that is caused by environmental exposure affect the whole population? Well, yeah, I guess. But so I guess these are things, though, that are particularly, again, picked up when we're doing these sort of larger scale surveillance type of studies, okay? So if you look at table 3.2 in your textbook, this is a whole giant list of these different environmental and occupational sentinel health events, okay? So I'll pull that up in a second. And again, who does this surveillance, right? It's the CDC, okay? So again, this is an example of epidemiological type of studies, right? So the CDC is going to compile health data on populations, right? Going to analyze it, interpret it, and basically, you know, maybe design and implement interventions to prevent and control these health problems, okay? So that's what it's saying here. Environmental information is combined with this epidemiological data of certain diseases, okay? And you actually can take a look at this. So I guess I'll click this first. There's a link here to just look at this. This is this National Biomonitoring Program, right, by the CDC. And you can basically take a look at that yourself. Okay, to actually see, you know, there's some additional information here, right? So it's going to tell you about the activities that they're doing, some publications and products, fact sheets, right? Chemical fact sheets, okay? In terms of different chemicals, right? These are obviously all things that, you know, actually some things that are mentioned in this chapter, but you can take a look at them and let's see what it says, right? It's going to tell you about that environmental chemical, right? This is a chemical hazard, and tell you about how people are exposed, right? And how this might affect people's health, give you some examples or information on levels of mercury in the U.S. population, okay? So this is just a resource to get some of this extra information. So I think super sort of helpful information. So I don't know if you had some concerns about a certain exposure like lead or mercury, like I have here, now you can use this resource to get a little bit more information about it. Okay, so I wanted to point that out. The other thing I want to point out is where these PDFs are. And so if you look in your Unit 1, right, figure and table PDFs, that's where they are. So for instance, Table 3.2, you can't really put it on a slide. It doesn't really work well that way. All of those, or these other figures that or tables that I'm going to refer to later on, there's a couple other ones. They're all in that there's the Chapter 3 folder. Essentially, I think the only figures are those from Chapter 3 anyway. But here's, Table 3.2 is what I'm referring to right now. And then I'll refer to these as well. Okay. So again, if you go back, they are in this folder here, right? Unit 1 figure and table PDFs. Okay, so I'll pull them up. I already have them downloaded. Also, there's one part where I'll sort of remind you to take a look at the case studies. So remember, all of the case studies for every chapter in Unit 1 are in this folder as well. So we're in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 case studies are there. So please take a look at them. And actually what I will most likely do is I'll probably do a separate recording where I go over these case studies, just because we may not have enough time to go over them completely in class. Okay. Somebody had asked about posting answers to the case studies, just written answers. I'm not going to do that because unfortunately, since we're taking exams electronically or remotely, people would then have access to copy and paste information. And that's not the point of the case studies. It's about understanding. So anyway, I will most likely do a recording to go over these Chapter 3 case studies in particular. Why? Because I think they're important, because they give specific information about kind of different examples. Okay. So particularly for this chapter, I think they're important. So I will put up most likely a separate recording to do that, or we'll do that in class. All right. So again, reminder, good idea to even look at these on your own though, right? And try to reason through them. And then you can listen to my recording with the explanations, right? Or listen in class. So just a kind of bit of advice. The case studies are helpful. Okay. With that said, those are not about memorizing. That's about understanding, right? So if I ask you on exam, a case study like question, there's really, I guess there are wrong answers, right? But there's not one specific right answer, put it that way. You can answer that question in many different ways. And as long as it shows understanding of the concept, you're most likely going to get full credit for that. Okay, so I just wanted to point out those things. Like I said, let's take a look at that Table 3.2. But you guys can look at that on your own. Those are there. So I'm not going to go through all the details. And I guess I apologize for, let's see, some of this maybe not showing up completely on the screen. So like I said, take a look at it on your own. Okay. So it's going to go through different hazards. Okay. It will also, I don't know why that's not showing you. Yeah. So anyway, for some reason, because the beginning is here, right? It's going to categorize them. Okay. So different hazards, biological hazards first. Going to give you some examples of industries and occupations with potential exposures, and then talk about these sentinel conditions, right? Remember, we're calling these sentinel conditions are conditions or diseases that will impact the population, not necessarily just the individual, right? Who's working in that area or what have you, or who's exposed. Okay, so it goes through biological hazards, chemical hazards, goes through all of the different hazards that we talked about. Okay, so take a look. Again, this is not about memorizing. You can see there are so many different environmental agents or hazards that can cause disease. I mean, and not every single one of them is listed here, but you can see how long the list is. Okay, all right. So like I said, take a look at that. Not about memorizing. Please do not memorize anything that's in that table. It's just about introducing the variety and the huge number of environmental and occupational hazards that exist and what they potentially can lead to. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so two terms here, vulnerability and susceptibility, if I could say those two terms. Think about what's meant by these terms. And actually, I have definitions in the notes section of the slide, but maybe think about first yourself what these terms mean, right? What does it mean to be vulnerable? I mean, to anything, but if you think about it within the scope of what we're talking about here, disease, right? And what does susceptibility mean? Okay, so think about it for a second, see kind of what you come up with, and let's kind of look down here at what I wrote here. So if you talk about vulnerability and you just want a basic definition, right? Increased chance of developing environmental disease, right? Or potential to develop the disease, okay? Now, if you talk about susceptibility, you can consider susceptibility as a vulnerability factor. Now, I have to say that this is sort of a big thing in science, in medicine, is to identify vulnerability factors, right? Or things that are susceptibility factors, okay? Develop biomarkers that indicate you're more vulnerable for a disease or more susceptible to develop a disease. So it's definitely something that is considered a lot in like I said, in science and medicine. But if you want to define susceptibility, right, it says characteristics that increase risk for environmental disease, okay? And like I said, you can consider that as a vulnerability factor. Things like maybe age, gender, genetics. These are all things that would increase your risk, okay? So I have a question here. What populations are generally more susceptible to environmental disease? So if you think about kind of special populations, so developing fetus, right? There are certain environmental agents that are going to particularly affect a developing baby, right? That can be that would be introduced to that developing fetus through placental route, right? Children. So children are particularly, I guess, more susceptible to environmental disease because they have a higher metabolic rate. They actually absorb much higher levels of, say, like environmental agents like lead and things like that. And so if in your house or in somewhere there was lead that was around, it would be children that would have health effects from it, not adults. Okay. Also, if you think about developmentally what's going on in children in terms of their brain is still developing, right? So that's also why they would be more affected. Okay. If you think about the geriatric population, this is also another sort of special population that would be more susceptible to environmental disease. So again, if another figure to point out, if you look at figure 3.4 in the textbook, this is showing you information about sort of response to exposures and how it varies by life state, pre-existing conditions, nutritional status, cultural practices, and it kind of it just kind of puts together some of these vulnerability factors. So it's sort of like a flow chart. So let me show you that. Oh, another thing here too. If you click on this, we were at that CDC website before. I had just particularly mentioned lead, right, in children. Another resource to get some more information about lead. And so this is just showing you some health effects, right, from short-term exposure to lead and then prolonged exposure to lead, what it can lead to, okay? So again, an extra resource to take a look at. So let me also just show you real quick that figure that I was referring to, okay? So again, take a look at that on your own. It's basically kind of showing you, here's your exposure to environmental factors and kind of all these different things that can contribute to the sort of formation of some of these health effects and health disparities. And this is just giving you an example of some of them, and we've already talked about some of them as well. But so really all of these boxes here can be considered vulnerability factors, okay? And so I'm sure you probably can come up with some of these on your own. And we sort of mentioned some of these already, but you can the idea is try to kind of fit all these together. And so if you look at environmental hazards, it's showing you some examples of those as well. Okay. It's also kind of showing you here, this dotted line is that you can have a health issue to begin with, right? And then be exposed and then have all these other things as well. And so you can see how all these things sort of fit together, right? And then all contribute to disease. Okay. The other thing, again, and I already did this was to remind you to take a look at the case studies in chapter 3. And as I said, I will most likely put up a separate recording where I go through those case studies, maybe not all of them, but one or two of them, because I think they're nice in terms of how they illustrate some specific examples of environmental exposures, and what diseases or health effects can happen as a result of those exposures. Okay. All right. If we specifically kind of just consider microbiology here, and again, this is obviously pertinent to our current situation, right? Says here, microorganisms are present everywhere, right? So I think we're all aware of that, right? In the air, on surfaces, everywhere. In order for an infection to occur, there's a couple things that kind of have to be in place, right? So sort of this kind of series of events here. It says an appropriate mode of transmission or transferal of the microorganism, right? In sufficient numbers. So this is even true, like if you think about different COVID cases, you could live with an individual that had COVID, but maybe, you never really directly inhaled those droplets, or you didn't inhale enough of them. Maybe there was never enough of them present on a surface that you touched and then you went to your mouth or nose or something like that. And so you have to have that appropriate mode of transmission. You have to have enough of the microorganism in order for it to ultimately or eventually cause disease. Also, the presence or the amount of those pathogenic organisms are enough of the ones that are virulent, right? So there are tons and tons, I said, of microorganisms around, but there are only certain ones that will cause disease or be virulent, okay? So that's that term there. So you have to have enough of them that are disease causing. If you talk about, another event is that you need to have a susceptible host, right? So we just talked about all these vulnerability or susceptibility factors, okay? So that host, right, their resistance to pathogenic microorganisms is not sufficient, right, to mount an immune response to clear that from the body before it causes disease, okay? So that's so if you mount that, so two people can be exposed to the same number of virulent bacteria, only one might develop the disease. Why? Or get ill. Why? Because their immune system maybe was able to clear that before it caused disease. So anyway, I think this again is pertinent, and I think this sort of illustrates the point and kind of shows you the interaction between sort of host factors, right? And then exposure. Okay. So some modes of transmission, if we're talking about microorganisms, airborne, right? Also water or food. So if you think about if there's areas of the world, like underdeveloped countries where water treatment isn't so good, or there's no water treatment at all, there are a lot of microorganisms that can be present in that water or that food supply. Different types of worms, right? Other types of microorganisms as well. So we're not only just talking about bacteria and viruses, but we're talking about other types of protists and things like that. And like I said, flatworms that could potentially then be ingested. Okay. Also, improper treatment of medical waste can lead to some of microorganisms being sort of released into the water supply or food supply as well. And then it also mentions here surface contact. I think that's kind of obvious in terms of a mode of transmission. Also worth mentioning toxicology, right? So we're talking about environmental effects. So toxicology is the study of harmful effects of xenobiotics. So this is a term that maybe you never heard of before, but all this really means is it's an exogenous chemical agent. Okay. So if you see that term xenobiotic, that's what it's referring to. And so in toxicology or toxicological research, right, is really done to understand the mechanisms by which chemicals produce adverse effects. So meaning like, if we expose an animal to a certain chemical, we want to know biologically or physiologically what the mechanism is to cause that type of adverse effect. So there's a lot of toxicology studies that really try to delve deep into the mechanism of how those adverse effects are occurring. Okay. Another mention of a surveillance program here that will examine the types of exposures to toxic chemicals in the U.S. So it's the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. So again, I think if we can kind of, the idea is if we're talking about environmental health and things that can that can produce environmental health issues, important that we have a lot of surveillance programs going on to make sure we're monitoring the levels of toxic chemicals in the environment. Example here of methylmercury exposure. Okay, so one of the ways that we can be exposed to methylmercury is by eating sort of infected fish or seafood. And so if you look at figure 3.5 here in a textbook, I don't have a picture here. It's just something you can look at on your own. You can even just search on the internet the mercury cycle, and I'm sure you would find a similar picture. And so in fact, I can probably, I don't know if it's really necessary, but if I went to the internet, like I said, and I searched, what did I say, mercury cycle? 1 second. Okay, so as I was saying, if you want to, look a little bit more about sort of methylmercury exposure, you can search up, and I just did this myself. You can just search up mercury cycle, okay? And this will show you that's basically the exact same figure that's figure 3.5 in the book, okay? And it's just showing you that. So the idea is that mercury or methylmercury is not normally or it's not a natural component of fish, right, and seafood. It's just that it ends up settling into the oceans, and then the fish and the aquatic life can be contaminated with it, essentially. And if you're constantly eating seafood from an area where that water is contaminated, you could actually end up with having pretty high exposures to methylmercury. Now, one of the case studies particularly is focused on methylmercury or mercury exposure. Okay, so that's why I was reminding you that it's important to look at those case studies here. So when I talk about the case studies, I'll talk maybe a little bit more about the methylmercury there. Okay, so again, right, there's things like volcanic eruptions and forest fires that will release mercury into the atmosphere. Okay. And then, like I said, that atmospheric mercury can then end up settling and depositing into the waters. And that's how it then contaminates the fish. Okay. So there are other types of sort of sources of the mercury in the atmosphere as well. That was just giving you an example there. So like coal burning, okay, major source of human-made environmental contamination. All right. So again, there are other sources as well. So that's where that's coming from. So let me, one other thing that I'm mentioning on this slide here is industrial hygiene. Okay. So there is a sort of discipline of science that's related to anticipating, recognizing, controlling, and evaluating hazards that will arise, right, in or from the workplace. And that can obviously directly affect the health of the worker, but also the community as well. And so important to identify these types of hazards that can be induced by a particular industry. Okay, so I just mentioned the coal mining, right? So huge impact on the surrounding environment in the community, and obviously a huge impact on the workers. And so the point is if there is some sort of environmental toxin that's around that workplace, then those workers will have to be protected, right? You have to take those measures that are necessary to protect those workers, okay? And so this is true for many other industries as well. Even you can think about working as a radiation technologist, right? You're going to have higher exposures to radiation, and so you have to make sure you protect yourself, okay? All right. Now, the next part of this talks about the basic pathophysiological mechanisms that are sort of caused by environmental hazards. And again, this is kind of a more, and I told you I sort of skipped over the epidemiology section 3.4, and I'm moving on to section 3.5 in the textbook. Okay. I'm actually going to stop here, and then I will upload a second recording for this last section of chapter 3.